Have you ever wondered what the exact sound of a collapsing future is? It isn't a scream, and it isn't the sound of shattering glass. It is a dry, soft rustle, the sound of a single, laminated sheet of paper sliding across a polished mahogany conference table. In that small, air-conditioned room in Chicago, the silence was heavy enough to feel. It tasted like expensive espresso and the faint, metallic scent of impending doom. Across from me sat Brad. He was wearing a navy blue suit that was clearly designed to project the image of a high-flying real estate consultant, a man who had everything under control. He looked comfortable, almost bored. He leaned back in his leather chair, tapping his fingers against the wood as if he were waiting for a lunch order, completely unaware that he had just handed me the keys to his own destruction. I didn't smile. I didn't lean forward to intimidate him. There was no need. Violence is the last refuge of the incompetent, and shouting is the weapon of the desperate. I simply sat there, spine straight, watching the way he checked his watch. He thought we were here for a routine title update on the family estate, a mundane paperwork task that he believed he could manipulate. He was so confident, so wrapped up in the persona of the successful son-in-law, that he didn't even notice the folder I had placed between us. It was a simple manila file, thick with documents that I had spent months curating. Inside were three things that would effectively end his life as he knew it: the forged deed of trust, the bill of sale for a 2026 C8 Corvette, and a printed, ready-to-sign copy of the FBI's white-collar crime reporting form. I looked at him, studying the way the fluorescent light caught the gold links on his wrist, and then I spoke. My voice was steady, calm, and stripped of any emotion. I told him that before he started explaining why he needed the property title updated, he might want to take a closer look at page 4 of the document he had submitted to the bank. I pointed to the notary seal, the jagged edge of the stamp ink on the paper. I watched his eyes narrow, just a fraction. He didn't know yet. He was still trying to maintain his composure. I reminded him that in the world of high-stakes legal documents, attention to detail is everything. Then, I pointed out the obvious mistake. He had spelled his own middle name wrong on the notary seal. It was a rookie error, a sign of panic disguised as confidence, and it was the thread that would unravel his entire tapestry of lies. The shift in the room was almost physical. Brad stopped tapping his fingers. The color began to drain from his face, receding from his cheeks like a tide pulling away from the shore. He looked down at the paper, and for a moment, he actually laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound that died in the heavy air. Then, he looked at me again, searching for a trace of a joke, or perhaps some mercy. He found neither. I sat there, perfectly still, a statue of quiet observation. I am not the kind of man who explodes in anger. I am the kind of man who builds a cage, brick by brick, and then silently locks the door. My career has not been in sales, or real estate, or the kind of flashy work Brad pretended to do. For 35 years, I worked as a senior forensic auditor for one of the largest insurance firms in New York. While most people spend their lives avoiding audits, I spent mine living inside them. My entire professional life was dedicated to the pursuit of truth hidden beneath mountains of data. I tracked offshore tax evasion, dismantled corporate embezzlement schemes, and exposed the kind of sophisticated fraud that would make an ordinary person's head spin. People often think that money is about greed, but in my experience, money is about patterns. Humans are messy, unpredictable creatures, but their finances are rigid. Numbers do not lie. They do not get tired. They do not get nervous, and they do not forget their middle names on a legal document. When I retired and moved to Chicago to be closer to my daughter Sarah, I didn't stop being an auditor. It is not just a job. It is a way of seeing the world. I treat my personal life with the same clinical, detached precision that I used to dismantle multi-million-dollar corporate fraud cases. I do not get angry when I see a discrepancy. I simply look for the source. My daughter Sarah is the opposite of me. She is kind, optimistic, and possesses a trusting nature that, while admirable, made her vulnerable to a predator like Brad. She saw the charm, the expensive watches, and the stories of lucrative consulting deals. I saw the data points. I saw the inconsistencies in his behavior, the late-night phone calls he would step outside to take, and the way he would suddenly become agitated whenever the topic of family assets came up. To Sarah, he was a successful husband building a future for them. To me, he was a liability, a loose variable in the equation of my family's security. I had been watching him for 18 months. I knew his habits, his associates, and his inflated sense of self-importance. I knew that men like Brad, who build their lives on the foundation of a lie, eventually get careless. They think they are the smartest people in the room because they haven't been caught yet. They mistake silence for ignorance. They think that because you aren't shouting or making scenes, you aren't paying attention. But while Brad was busy playing the role of the successful provider, I was busy documenting his descent. I was the architect of the environment he had walked into, and as he sat across from me in that room, finally realizing the trap had closed, he was learning a hard lesson. Some of us are always watching, and we never close the file until the audit is complete. It started with the consulting fees. That was the phrase Brad used whenever Sarah asked about his sudden influx of cash. For months, he had been struggling, barely scraping by with part-time jobs that he claimed were beneath his potential. Then, almost overnight, he began talking about a windfall from a commercial real estate deal. The story shifted every time he told it, which was the first sign that the narrative was fabricated. Within weeks, the shift in his lifestyle was visible. He traded his worn-out sedan for a watch that cost as much as a small car, and he began throwing around terms like market cycles and strategic liquidity at Sunday dinners. To Sarah, he was a man on the rise. To me, he was a man who had suddenly gained access to a pile of cash he hadn't earned. I watched him closely, not with suspicion, but with the detached interest of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. I knew that greed has a very specific rhythm, and Brad was dancing to a beat that was completely out of sync with his actual income. The real trouble began with a notification from the county clerk. I owned a guest house on my estate, a modest property that I had put in a trust for Sarah years ago to ensure her financial security. I had retained the management rights, so all property tax notifications came directly to my study. On a quiet Tuesday, while I was out of town attending a conference, a notice arrived regarding a significant change in the property's title status. The letter was vague, mentioning a refinancing event that I had never authorized. Most people would have ignored it, assuming it was a mistake or junk mail, but I don't believe in mistakes when it comes to legal documentation. I sat in my study, the sunlight slanting across the desk, and stared at the paper. It was a red flag the size of a billboard. I immediately pulled the digital records, and there it was. A high-interest bridge loan had been taken out against the property's equity. The process of the investigation was slow, methodical, and entirely necessary. I didn't reach out to Brad. I didn't call the bank. I didn't confront Sarah. Instead, I started tracing the steps. I looked at the timestamps on the loan documents. I cross-referenced them with the calendar. It turned out that on the exact day the loan application was processed, Brad had told Sarah he was at a business lunch in the city. I spent the next 2 days visiting the notary public he had used, a small, cluttered office in a strip mall miles away from his supposed office. The notary was a tired-looking woman who didn't remember much, but she did remember that the man had seemed very rushed and very nervous. I recorded our conversation, keeping my voice low and polite. It became clear that Brad had walked in there, presented a forged power of attorney document with my name on it, and had it stamped. It was a lazy, sloppy job, but it was enough to fool a notary who was more interested in a quick fee than in verifying the identity of the person sitting in front of her. A week later, the final piece of the puzzle pulled into the driveway. It was a torch-red Corvette, gleaming under the afternoon sun. It was an expensive, impractical, and loud statement of victory. Brad climbed out, looking like he was auditioning for a commercial about success, and began bragging to Sarah about his company lease. He told her that his firm was so impressed with his performance that they had provided him with a vehicle as a bonus. I stood at the window, watching him walk toward the house, and I felt nothing but a cold, hard clarity. I knew his company. I had done the due diligence weeks ago. His firm had filed for bankruptcy protection 3 months prior, and they certainly weren't in the business of leasing luxury sports cars to junior consultants. He was using the money from the fraudulent loan, money that had been pulled from the equity of my daughter's future home, to buy a toy that he could parade around in. The betrayal wasn't just about the money. Money can always be earned again. The betrayal was in the arrogance of the act. He had entered my study, rifled through my private papers, forged my signature, and gambled with the foundation of my family's security, all so he could look impressive in a car he didn't deserve. He had assumed that I was too old, too removed, or too trusting to notice the details. He had treated my life, and my daughter's life, as a resource to be exploited for his own vanity. It was a profound level of disrespect, but it was also a tactical error. He had left a trail of paper, a trail of digital footprints, and a trail of lies that were all starting to cross over one another. I spent the following nights in my study, not sleeping, but working. I compiled the documents, organized the bank statements, and mapped out the flow of the stolen money. I tracked the wire transfers from the bank to the shell account he had set up under a fake business name, and then to the dealership. The pattern was clean. The paper trail was unbroken. Every time I found a new piece of evidence, I didn't feel rage. I felt a sense of professional satisfaction. There is a certain beauty in watching a fraud scheme fall apart, especially when the person who created it is so utterly convinced of their own brilliance. I knew exactly where the cracks were, and I knew exactly how to make them split wide open. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to fight. All I needed was the document, and by the end of that week, I had enough to ensure that Brad would never again mistake my silence for weakness. Most people believe that a real investigation is about running around, chasing shadows, or having tense confrontations in dark alleys. They get that idea from movies, where everything is dramatic and loud. But in my world, in the world of forensic auditing, an investigation is actually about sitting in a quiet room with a cup of lukewarm coffee and staring at paperwork until the truth decides to reveal itself. It is a slow, methodical process that requires patience, a sharp eye, and the understanding that human beings are remarkably predictable. When I set out to dismantle the mess Brad had created, I didn't need a gun, and I didn't need a lawyer. I just needed the paper trail. I began by requesting the full loan origination file from the bank. This was the most critical step. Most people don't realize that when you take out a loan, you aren't just signing a contract, you are creating a permanent record of your deceit. I called the lending department, identifying myself as the primary property holder. I played the role of the confused, aging homeowner, asking for clarification on the terms of the refinance that had been processed on my property. The bank employee was helpful, eager to appease a longtime client, and emailed me the entire packet within an hour. They didn't even think to verify why the homeowner was asking for documents that the borrower, my son-in-law, should have already had. They just saw a satisfied customer. When the file arrived in my inbox, I sat at my desk and opened it with the steady hands of a surgeon. The first thing I looked at was the signature. Brad had forged my name. It was a lazy, uninspired attempt. He had clearly traced it over a document he had found in my study. To the untrained eye, it might have looked legitimate, but to me, it was a glaring error. I could see the tremor in the pen strokes where he had hesitated, the unnatural angle of the loops, and the way the ink pooled in the final letter. It was the signature of a man who was terrified of being caught, and it was the first piece of evidence that would hold up in any court of law. But that was just the beginning. I moved on to the financial statements he had submitted to qualify for the loan. He had claimed a level of income that simply didn't exist. I pulled his tax returns, which were masterpieces of fiction. He had fabricated invoices from his shell company, inventing clients and projects that sounded impressive but were entirely hollow. He had used a generic template for the invoices, not realizing that different clients in different industries have specific billing formats. I spent the night cross-referencing his proof of income with the actual activity of the companies he claimed to work for. It was like solving a child's puzzle. He hadn't even bothered to check if those companies existed in the state database. He had assumed that the bank, overworked and desperate to approve loans, wouldn't bother to look. He was right about the bank, but he had failed to account for me. The next day, I visited the notary public he had used. I didn't go in with accusations. I went in with a polite request. The notary was a small, quiet woman who worked in a strip mall office that smelled of toner and stale air. I showed her the document, pointed to the signature, and told her I was conducting an internal audit for the bank regarding a potential error. I had my phone in my pocket, recording the entire conversation. She looked at the paper, sighed, and admitted that the man, Brad, had come in a rush. She said he had been sweating and nervous, claiming he had forgotten his identification, but promising that the documents were urgent. She had stamped them, she confessed, because she had been busy with other customers and didn't want the confrontation. That recording was my second victory. With the forgery confirmed and the notary's admission in hand, the final step was tracking the money. I used a simple public record search to trace the wire transfers. Brad had moved the loan money into a business account for a company called Elite Property Solutions, a name so generic it was almost insulting. From there, I followed the trail. The money didn't sit in the account. It was transferred within hours to a luxury car dealership. I didn't need to break into his accounts. The trail was wide open. I pulled the bank statements, the transaction logs, and the bill of sale. By the time I finished, I had a file that was perfect. It was neat, organized, and absolutely devastating. I had the forged signature, the fake income documents, the notary's admission, and the bank records showing exactly where the stolen money had gone. I had spent days building this case, working while everyone else was asleep, piecing together the timeline of his greed. I had built a cage, and I had ensured that it was bolted shut. I looked at the stack of papers on my desk, the evidence of his downfall, and I felt a cold, professional sense of peace. I had done my due diligence. I had the facts, and facts, unlike opinions or arguments, are impossible to fight. The day of the confrontation was a masterclass in controlled atmosphere. I didn't want a scene in a hallway or a shouting match in the driveway. I wanted him in an environment where he felt invincible, so the fall would be that much more effective. I had invited him to a private meeting at the law firm I had consulted for years, located in the heart of downtown Chicago. I told him it was a routine legal review regarding the estate assets. He arrived early, dressed in a sharp suit, radiating the kind of hollow confidence that only comes from a man who thinks he's successfully pulled off the perfect crime. He walked into the conference room, pulled out a chair, and signaled for a water, acting as if he owned the building. He was still the man with the stolen car and the fake bank balance, completely oblivious to the fact that his reality was about to be deleted. I arrived 5 minutes later. I didn't rush. I carried a single, slim manila folder, the most dangerous item in the room. I sat down, placed the folder on the table, and didn't open it. I just looked at him. I watched the way his eyes flickered, the slight nervous habit he had of adjusting his cufflinks. He started in with his rehearsed small talk, something about market trends and his recent successes. I let him speak. I let him dig the hole a little deeper with every word, allowing him to weave a narrative of prosperity that I already knew was built on rotting timber. When he finally stopped, waiting for me to acknowledge his brilliance, I simply pulled the folder toward me and laid out the documents in a deliberate, measured arc. I didn't lead with the accusations. I led with the facts. I opened with the forged deed of trust, sliding it across the polished mahogany until it rested directly under his hands. I told him, with a voice as calm as a flat lake, that the lender had been contacted. I explained that I had provided them with a sworn affidavit of forgery, and that the internal fraud investigation was already underway. He started to laugh, a dismissive sound, but it caught in his throat when I pushed the second document across, the bank's record of the fraudulent income verification. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just looked him in the eye and described the exact federal statute he had violated: wire fraud and forgery. I explained how, because he had used a federally insured bank to facilitate the theft, this was no longer a family dispute, it was a federal felony. The change in him was instantaneous. The smug, curated persona he had worn like a mask didn't just slip, it shattered. He stared at the documents, his fingers hovering over the paper as if touching it would burn him. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands on the table, and watched the realization wash over him. He tried to interrupt, to offer an excuse, some frantic, pathetic story about it being a temporary misunderstanding or a strategic bridge loan that he intended to pay back. I didn't offer a rebuttal. I didn't need to argue with him. I simply opened the folder to the final page, the bill of sale for the Corvette. I pointed out that the car was now legally classified as an asset purchased with the proceeds of a crime. I informed him that the bank had already issued a repossession order. He was shaking now, his face a pale, ghostly gray. He looked at the door, then back at me, as if he expected someone to walk in and save him from the weight of his own choices. But the room was silent. There were no interruptions. I told him that I hadn't come to negotiate, and I hadn't come to listen to his apologies. I had come to provide him with the audit trail of his own life. I pointed out that the bank's legal team was already preparing to file a formal complaint with the authorities. I had made sure that my hands were clean, and that the trail leading directly to his doorstep was crystal clear. He tried one last time to pivot, to play the victim of circumstance card, but I cut him off with a single, sharp sentence. Brad, your middle name is on the forgery, and the bank has the recording of your signature. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp, suffocating terror. He looked small in that expensive suit, sitting in that high-backed chair, realizing that he had tried to outmaneuver an auditor, a man who spent his life waiting for people like him to make one mistake. He had bet everything on the idea that I wouldn't pay attention to the details. He had lost everything because I couldn't stop looking at them. The reversal was total. He was no longer the hunter, and he certainly wasn't the man in charge. He was just a thief, caught in a cage of his own design, waiting for the consequences to arrive. The signature was the final nail. Brad signed the confession of debt, the affidavit of resignation of interest, and the documents necessary to clear the lien on my property. He didn't fight it. There was no room left for negotiation. I watched his hand tremble as he wrote his name, the ink bleeding slightly into the paper, a permanent mark of his surrender. That signature, The final one he would ever provide in this context was the end of his game. Within 48 hours, the Corvette was gone. The bank, in its zeal to recover assets, moved faster than I had even anticipated. They didn't care about his excuses or his desperate pleas. They cared about the collateral, and they took it. He lost the car, he lost the leverage, and he lost the carefully curated illusion of success. He had spent his final savings trying to maintain that facade, and now he had absolutely nothing left to maintain it with. He was a hollow man in a cheap suit, standing in the cold light of reality. The legal consequences were not something I had to initiate. When you commit fraud against a federally insured institution, you trigger a chain reaction that you cannot stop. The bank took the case to the authorities the moment they verified the forgery. My role was simple. I provided the file, the evidence, the timeline, and the notary's testimony. I gave the investigators a gift-wrapped package of guilt. He is now facing multiple felony charges. The legal system is slow, grinding, and impartial. It doesn't care about your sob stories or your justifications. It cares about the paperwork, and the paperwork was ironclad. He is caught in the gears now, and there is no clever way out of this. There is no loophole. He was a small-time grifter who tried to play a high-stakes game, and he lost, not because I defeated him, but because he was never equipped to win in the first place. Sarah, my daughter, was the hardest part of the equation. I never wanted to hurt her, but I couldn't protect her from the truth forever. I sat her down in the same kitchen where Brad used to tell his elaborate lies about his consulting firm. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice or try to manipulate her emotions. I simply put the bank statements, the loan documents, and the proof of the forged signature on the table. She looked at the handwriting she knew better than anyone, and she saw the betrayal in every curve of the pen. There was no need for a dramatic confrontation. The evidence did the work for me. She realized that everything about their marriage, from the expensive dinners to the house upgrades, was built on a foundation of theft. It wasn't love. It was a transaction that she wasn't a party to. They are separated now. The process is clean, surgical, and final. She deserves better, and now she has the space to find it. As for the house, it is secure. The lien was removed through an affidavit of forgery and a series of legal filings that restored the title to its rightful place. I reclaimed my study, I reclaimed my privacy, and I reclaimed the peace of mind that Brad had tried to steal. It was a simple bureaucratic correction, but it felt like a restoration of order. I like order. I like knowing where things stand. I like knowing that the assets are protected and that the liability has been effectively removed from the balance sheet. I spent so much of my career fixing broken systems, and fixing this one brought me a strange kind of comfort. It proved that even when things are broken, they can be mended if you are willing to do the work. People often mistake silence for weakness. They think that because you aren't screaming, you aren't doing anything. They view a quiet observer as a passive bystander. That is a dangerous mistake to make. If you spend your life looking for patterns, you stop being surprised by chaos. Greed is a predictable mechanism. It has a rhythm, a cadence, and a fatal flaw. If you know how to read the ledger, you can see exactly when someone decides to jump off the cliff. You don't have to push them. They run off the edge all on their own. They are so consumed by the next gain that they stop watching the ground beneath their feet. Brad was no different. He thought he was the hunter, but he was just a variable in a calculation he didn't understand. I didn't do this for revenge. Revenge is an emotional reaction, and emotions are messy. They cloud your judgment and lead to mistakes. I did this for the audit. My life is balanced, the accounts are clear, and the liability, Brad, has been removed from the ledger. There is no joy in watching someone destroy their own life, just a cold, clinical acceptance of the outcome. I am back to my books, my coffee, and my quiet life. The house is silent again, but this time, it is the silence of peace, not the silence of a held breath. Don't ever mistake a person's kindness for a lack of surveillance. Some of us are always watching, and we never close the file until the final balance is zero. That is the only way to live, with the accounts balanced, the records clean, and the truth, no matter how quiet, always holding the final word.